Welcome to the last session of the day, and I know we're all excited about cocktail hour that follows. This is the Global and National Trends in Mitigation in Environmental Markets panel, and I think it's going to be really, really interesting. We've got a really wide array of viewpoints here on the panel today. My name's George Kelly. I'm CEO of Earth Recovery Partners. I've been 26 years in the environmental market space, now part of an advisory firm that helps young companies basically in the environmental market and nature-based solution sector. The panel today is from left to right, is Chris Turner of the Commodities and Futures Trading Commission. Lucas, I'm so sorry. And Redman of Brown and Caldwell, and Brian Kevill of MKO. And Brian, of course, is all the way from Ireland, and it's not Thursday yet, but you'll hear a little bit of some of the Irish viewpoint. I think what you're going to hear is there's a very unique orientation, and what we'll do is introduce each, and then have about 10 minutes before we get into moderated dialogue. We then hope to open it up to the audience for Q&A. I will put in a plug. This is kind of an effort to begin to address these global and national trends and environmental markets. There is going to be a global environmental market finance summit in Denver in July, which is going to really dig into more detail on a lot of these issues. So before I do proceed with our panelists, I'm going to set the table a little bit and take the moderator's prerogative and try to just walk through some of the things other than the kind of the Clean Water Act, Endangered Species Act regulatory world that we live in. And first, I just wanted to kind of walk through some of the backdrop on biodiversity. The World Wildlife Fund noted in 2022 report that between 1970 and 2018, there was an average decline of 69% around the world of mammals, fish, reptiles, birds, and amphibians. Freshwater species saw an overall decline of 83%. The 6 biggest threats are ag, hunting, logging, pollution, invasive species, and climate change. But here's the most interesting thing as you think about this. Over 50% of our global domestic product is reliant on nature. Some would say 100 when you think about everything we do. But if we did nothing, a lot of the economists are saying that we'd basically decline by 18% in our GDP. And so it's a huge issue. I'm going to get into some of the initiatives later at the bottom. We kind of mentioned that, and I'll talk about that. Now, climate. You know, we all know about the drought dynamics and we had low water levels in Mississippi, the Danube rivers, water scarcity in the West, Colorado River, Rio Grande, record floods in California, Pakistan, wildfires, California, Colorado, Australia, melting glaciers, record temperatures here in April in Europe, fisheries like snow crab in Alaska halted last year, the lack of snow in Europe. We've had 22 disasters of over $1 billion in the US. The Great Salt Lake is disappearing. We're at jeopardy of achieving our objectives. So this is the context we're all working in, and I think it's important sometimes we take a step back about how important the work we're doing is relative to these kind of issues, and we're at the front end of this. So just to give you a sense of some of the global frameworks that are out there, the IUCN, which I think a lot of you all are familiar with, has this red list on threatened and endangered species, but they have something called the Impact Mitigation and Ecological Compensation theme group that are looking at compensation worldwide, and I think the group, this body, is really well adept in trying to inform that effort as a lot of countries wrestle with those issues. The United Nations, we obviously are, a lot of us are familiar with the Sustainable Development Goals. I think a lot of you have heard of what's called the 30 by 30, 30% conservation by 2030, which is an international initiative. Also, there's the Convention for Biological Diversity, COP15, which I attended in Montreal this year, and we'll walk a little bit through what's went on there. And there are a host of other things that you can see in this slide. There's also something not on this slide, the Biodiversity Credit Alliance. Some of our members here today are members of that group, trying to shape what's called a voluntary biodiversity credit. And boy, have we worked this, here again, this group has spent a lifetime defining a biodiversity credit, and I think we should be helping and informing that. But frankly, there's not a lot of US presence in that effort. So relative to this COP15 and the voluntary biodiversity framework that came out of that, as I mentioned, the 30 by 30 initiative. But one of the most interesting things, there were 100 financial institutions there. There were at least 330 businesses. I'm told 1,500. But there were 330 businesses that wanted to promote a level playing field for high standards relative to biodiversity. And we'll walk through what that initiative is. But so you think about what we went through in the mitigation rule in 2003 to 2008. We were driving a level playing field for all forms of mitigation. It's a similar kind of viewpoint, but this time businesses are saying, we want high standards. We don't want to race to the bottom. There's the financial institutions, the theme is financing green. They think there's a lot of money to be made financing green initiatives, but also greening finance. How do we ensure that those investments made are green? As I mentioned, so the three initiatives that came out of that I'm interested in is, one is disclosure, the disclosure on the reliance and impacts of nature, and this is a corporate disclosure requirement, similar to the climate side, which could be very transformative. The other thing is subsidies. There's about $1.8 trillion of subsidies right now that are used to basically destroy the environment. And a lot of folks are looking at that and saying, can we take $700 billion of that and use it to preserve the environment? And I think there's a big initiative on that. The final point is to halt the decline of biodiversity by 2030 and then become what's called nature positive by after 2030. So that's the new framework. We have no net loss in our world, nature positive in this biodiversity world. And there is something called the Task Force for Nature-Related Financial Disclosures, and that's a risk management disclosure standard setting group, over 800 institutions. They came out with a beta version of that in March of this year, and they expect to finalize that by September. And you have many corporate institutions like Bank of America and others are a big part of this. On the carbon side, I think we haven't spoke a lot about that at this conference, but we're on a COP28. But there is efforts from setting rules for the carbon markets, and it's quite complicated. But one thing that I'm looking at is this CORSIA, which is an international cap and trade carbon market for the aviation sector. This will be the first market that's sector-wide that transcends international and national focus. And you can see from the time frame, right now we're in a pilot initiative, but it'll become mandatory in 2027. And there's task force on scaling voluntary carbon markets. There's a task force for carbon-related financial disclosures, and a host of other things. Now here in the US, I think we're all familiar with some of the initiatives that are going on, but we'll just kind of briefly go through that before I turn to Chris. One is the Inflation Reduction Act, massive amount of dollars being spent. I sit on the EPA Financial Advisory Board, and we have been tasked with looking at about how to spend $27 billion by October of 2024 for greenhouse gas reductions. And they're on course to begin that process this summer. So major initiatives. Then we have the SEC climate disclosure rules. There was a draft set of rules. It's created a lot of consternation, threats of lawsuits. Those are still in the offing. Maybe Chris has some insights on that. I don't know. The other thing is we have the executive order for the U.S. government to be carbon neutral by 2050. We now have these things called the social cost of carbon that the administration said is now $51 a ton. And that means when you do these cost-benefit analysis as part of OMB review and other types of review, you now have to build in a $51 a ton cost. In addition, there are tax credits for things like direct air capture and something like carbon capture and utilization and storage. Some major initiatives that are driving a lot of engineered solutions at the carbon side. We have the executive order 30 by 30. We have flood mitigation and FEMA hazardous mitigation using nature-based management retreat. So the nature-based solutions are a big part of that. I think we have the White House Nature-Based Solutions Roadmap, which was put forth in November of 2022. And we have a joint effort with Australia to create natural capital accounting, which is really transformative when you think about where we go. So with that in mind, I want to turn to our first speaker, Chris Lucas. And Chris, my apologies, I had Turner down there and I apologize. But Chris is the Chief of Staff and Counsel to Commissioner Summer Mersinger at the Commodities Future Trading Commission. Prior to joining CFTC, Chris was co-head of the U.S. Government Affairs at BNY Mellon. Before joining BNY Mellon, Chris served in the Senate in a variety of roles. First, as counsel to the Small Business Committee, ranking member Olympia Snowe, where he was Senator Snow's lead staffer during the consideration of what became the Dodd-Frank Act. Later, Chris was investigative counsel to Senate Judiciary Committee ranking member Charles Grassley, where he focused on investigations and oversight into financial markets and financial market regulations, and finally as legislative counsel to Senator Mike Rounds, where he was responsible for the Senator's Banking Committee portfolio, as well as a host of other issues relating to agriculture. Chris has a BA from the University of Rochester and a JD from Brooklyn Law School. Chris, we're so honored to have you here today, and we look forward to welcome you for your initial remarks.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I thank you for having me. And one of the interesting things, and maybe I'll take a step back and talk a little bit about what the CFTC is and why I'm here today. So the CFTC is a markets regulator, and basically what we do is we ensure integrity in the markets that we oversee, but we're a little bit different. So you referenced the SEC. The SEC is a spot market regulator, and what I mean by spot market is the actual cash market. You know, you give somebody money, they give you securities. That's the cash market, the spot market. We are a derivatives market regulator, so we're one level above that. So as an example, we do cattle futures, but we don't regulate the buying and selling of cows. And so when we talk about carbon markets, as an example, we regulate the carbon derivatives markets. So it's the futures carbon markets that we regulate. And so when you think about us, then the next question is, okay, so you're a secondary market regulator. One sort of asterisk to that is, in the markets that we regulate on the secondary level, we do have fraud and abuse authority for the spot market. So as an example, you might have seen that we do not regulate the crypto markets, but we have launched an awful lot of enforcement actions against crypto firms, because if there is fraud and abuse in the spot market, it affects the futures market. So the next question is, what is a commodity? And a commodity can basically be anything. It can be corn, it can be cryptocurrency, it can be carbon dioxide. And it's a great opportunity for us because it means that essentially what we see is a spot market will develop, and then all of a sudden there is a desire to hedge. And so that's when secondary markets develop. And essentially we work through our regulated exchanges, and our regulated exchanges will come to us and say, we would like to list a product on carbon dioxide. And so we're a principles-based regulator, so we're product agnostic, whatever you want to list, so long as it meets our principles. So for example, the product has to be liquid. You know, people have to want to trade it. There have to be customer protections built into the product. We have to be sure that it's not going to be abused. And so long as you can fit within that very wide door, you can list those products. And so as I've been learning here today, there are a lot of nature-based products that you say to yourself, and again, right, we're product agnostic, so we don't go to people and say, you should create a market in X and we're going to regulate it. But if people come to us and say, we think that we would like a functioning derivatives market, we are happy to regulate them. And I hear a discussion about credits and these types of markets, and when we talk about things like price discovery and liquidity and an interest from producers in price certainty and in end users in price certainty, you kind of scratch your head and you're like, oh, this looks like maybe it's a spot market that's ready for a derivatives market. But again, I leave that up to all of you. And so finally, what are the positive attributes of CFTC regulated markets? Why do people seek us out and want us to regulate their markets? So one of the main benefits is price transparency. So that idea that, let's use corn for an example. You can go online or open the newspaper and know the price of corn today. So anybody, any farmer, whether they are in Iowa or Illinois, knows that at the CME, corn is currently trading for X price. And that's extremely beneficial to an industry where you don't have that price transparency. Now, think about it from a producer standpoint. If I don't know what I can sell my product for, how do I know what my profit and loss margin is going to be? And so by doing that, you give them that certainty. Also, from a producer perspective, you can forward sell your product. So going back to corn, that farmer, before he puts a seed in the ground, can forward sell his crop, can get cash for it, and then can use that cash to purchase the seed, fertilizer, et cetera, et cetera. So you as a producer of that good have that price certainty where you know I've already sold my crop before I even put it in the ground, or the metal that I've taken out of the ground, or whatever it might be. And then on the end user side, so what you can do is you can fix your cost. So let's just say that you are Quaker Oats, and you know that you're going to be buying a lot of oats. What you can do is you can buy oat futures on an exchange, and you can know that I have set the price that I'm going to need for my raw materials before I have created a single box of Quaker Oats. I know what it's going to be. And that certainty is something that large corporates that participate in the market really appreciate. And then again, producers that participate in the market appreciate that certainty as well. And then there's that utility of price discovery as well. So I think, again, we have carbon dioxide markets. They are very robust. It's interesting, we have what we call compliance markets. And that's, George, to your point, where the federal government or some other government entity, we have it in California, we have RGGIs for the regional compact, where a company must purchase those credits in order to engage in the business it wants to engage in. But then we also have voluntary markets, which are very robust. And that is in part because corporations want to be able to say, look, we're offsetting our carbon emissions, but also because they're starting to look at the SEC disclosures, and there are a wide variety of corporate interests that they are interested in pursuing that would be met by purchasing those credits. And so I think one of the things that we've seen over maybe the past 5 to 10 years or so is this real growth in environmental markets. We know that whether they are compliance markets or voluntary markets, on the compliance side, governments have set clear policies in place. They're not going away. There's a certainty, there's a development of a spot market, and so people feel comfortable with creating those derivatives markets. And then on the voluntary side, there are other positive benefits that come along with purchasing these credits, and companies feel like it's a good value. And so when you start to see those things and you start to see business of a certain volume, then we start to see derivatives markets created. So yeah, really excited to be here, and I feel like I'm kind of at the beginning of the discussion of what environmental markets can be. So thanks so much for having me.
Great. We're going to have some more conversation on this because I think there are some folks exploring secondary markets, and obviously we'd love to get into some of the details on the carbon side of the equation. Our next speaker is Redman, and Ann doesn't need an introduction. She's been in this business for many, many years, since its inception. Have you been to every one of these conferences? 26 years?
No, but I was just remembering that I spoke at the first one, and I looked up, it's like how and why to do mitigation banking.
But Ann is the managing principal with Brown and Caldwell. She's an environmental professional in natural resource consulting and regulation who specializes in managing complex projects relying on consensus building approaches to maximize the end results. She brings decades of experience in environmental regulation and planning, spanning the areas of watershed scale regulatory and planning solutions, all aspects of watershed level cumulative impacts and habitat assessment, wetland mitigation, and frameworks for restoration planning. Ms. Redman led numerous assessments of water resource and ecosystem services on projects ranging from individual landowner to national scale. She is a private sector representative of the National Research Council Committee on Mitigating Wetland Losses, which studied and reported on wetland mitigation under the Section 404 regulatory program, and upon which the 2008 federal mitigation rules are based. She especially enjoys the challenges presented in integrating science and policy, and that's one of the things we're going to hear from Ann really about, this blend between the intersect between the voluntary and the regulatory space and how that's playing out in a practical way.
Thanks, George. I work as a consultant, and I work with public sector clients and private sector clients around the U.S., and they often come to us for help with regulatory issues and requirements that need to be met. And now we're seeing more and more activity in the voluntary offset space. And in my mind, in a perfect world, the net effect of all this would be that all these activities, the regulatory requirements and achieving the voluntary offsets, is to have those reviewed at a landscape scale so that you could, in the end, have a result of regional ecosystem restoration and conservation. And so there's a little bit of a history kind of feeding into this concept and this idea. I grew up in the 60s and 70s. It was sort of a heady time in the environmental space. We were all reading Silent Spring and the population bomb, and really thinking big about how we could improve the world we were living in. In '72, the Clean Water Act was passed, and suddenly the Corps of Engineers was regulating wetlands in its dredge and fill regulatory program. About 15 years later, here in Florida, and I'll use Florida as a case study, just because, partly because of the familiarity, but also because of its deep similarity to the federal programs. We passed the Henderson Act, and in that, we expanded the area of what jurisdiction of what we called wetlands to really represent the true extent of what wetlands are versus simply deep swamps. And the other side of that coin is, now that we're regulating real wetlands, there needed to be some compromise. That's when compensatory mitigation was introduced in the Florida regulatory dredge and fill permitting space. A few years later, I led a study. Kevin Irwin, who may or may not be here, led a study, and I think there was at least one other study around 1990 about the performance of these compensatory mitigation sites, which at the time were really, we're going to create new wetlands. It has to be all brand new, on-site, in kind. And we learned a lot of lessons from these various studies. And these studies also coincided with Carol Browner coming to Florida to head our then Florida DER. And when Carol saw the results of these studies, she directed the agency to begin to prefer wetland restoration and rehabilitation over creation of wetlands where they had never previously existed. The 90s continue when we're still kind of, part of my job was to go out and, sing to the choir out in the districts. Let's do more restoration, more rehabilitation, work with permittees. And we did some interesting work during that time, but still we were fighting the dogma of on-site in kind. And I found that everyone's an expert, which made it all the more, more fun and challenging to get our job done. All these studies and learning more and more led to the EPA commissioning the National Research Council to study the performance of wetland compensatory mitigation throughout the U.S. under the Section 404 permitting program. And the report from that committee is really what the 2008 federal mitigation rules are now based on. And in my mind, the most important thing about those rules is that the central premise of it is to follow and use a watershed approach to determining what the appropriate compensatory mitigation is for any project. And that it helps you get away from that on-site in-kind creation dogma. What's really going to work best for the watershed? Stepping aside from the regulatory space, there is other stuff going on in the world at the same time. Around the same time, the World Resources Institute, WRI, I'm not sure I got the right name here. WRI was publishing their reports on ecosystem services and how we can improve the ecosystem health, watershed health, help deal with these climate change issues we're facing, if we would start paying attention to ensuring the ecosystem services were conserved and restored. There were a series of efforts in the US and globally to fund and incentivize ecosystem services work. And a number of these started to intersect with some of the credit markets. One way to, if you were restoring wetlands and gaining wetland credit for that, whether as compensatory mitigation or as a mitigation bank or a species bank, or a water quality trading program, or a carbon trading program, those kinds of projects also were able to address these issues related to ecosystem services. Not all of them, but some of them. Moving forward a little bit more in time, about the time I joined Brown and Caldwell, I can't say who the client was, but we had a client who was working in the ESG space. So environmental, social, and governance space. It was my first real introduction to the ESG space. And what this person was doing, he was the water resources director for a global manufacturing entity, and they have facilities all around the world. And one of the things in his job that he had to report was, how are our facilities doing? But to senior management, that needs to be some pie charts and some relatively simple graphics. Well, there are a number of tools out there by WRI and some others whose names I'm forgetting at the moment, who provided tools that were really good at illustrating the water risk and scarcity issues that they were facing globally. But they also spit out GRI indices results. So these were indices that the investment community is interested in. What the Bloomberg Index, the Dow Sustainability Index, the GRI, the CDP, those are things that the global investment community is looking at to see how sustainable or how green are the operations of this entity. So he was doing a dual thing here. A few years later, came back, the tools had advanced. So we worked with them to help improve and expand their reporting and their internal reporting to do a better job reporting these to management, but also a more accurate reporting out to the investment indices. And then with that, they were able to then follow up with prioritizing, scheduling, the updating of various facilities in the world, and also determining where. So sometimes you had a water scarcity problem. You had plenty of water, but it was such bad quality you couldn't use it. You had to build a huge filtration system and was it really worth it? Or was it more effective to work with the watershed and the community to get a watershed program in place to improve the water quality? So all that's out of the ESG space. And I'm skipping over a few things, which brings me to a case study that I just want to tell you very briefly about that has me really excited about this marriage between the regulatory world and the voluntary markets world. The city of Winter Haven here in Florida, and I don't know if anyone from Winter Haven's here, has an integrated One Water management plan, and we at Brown & Caldwell and other firms define One Water as really integrating all your water, everything in your water space, your wastewater, stormwater, reuse water, groundwater. And they, as part of that, they are restoring what they call their Sapphire Necklace, which is a 60-mile necklace around the city of Winter Haven. And the fundamental purposes of the Sapphire Necklace are to restore the historic hydro patterns in the watershed and to recharge the aquifer. That particular aquifer is over committed, so it's really important that everyone do what they can to recharge the aquifer system. One of the main features of the Sapphire Necklace is that the wetlands, they'll be restoring wetlands, and those wetlands will be able to store excess stormwater. That stormwater will then infiltrate and recharge the superficial groundwater. They can also include, in drought periods, highly treated reuse water can be sent to these wetlands to keep them hydrated. And then excess water at various times that are conditioned in can be injected into a recharge well to recharge the upper Floridan aquifer. So why am I really talking about this? Because this is a half $500 million program. To implement the entire Sapphire Necklace is a $500 million over probably 20 years. The city's looking for many, many ways to pay for this. The first project is being paid for by Pepsi. But why? Pepsi is pulling 200 million gallons a year out of the same aquifer. They need, for their ESG goals, to replenish 200 million gallons a year into that same aquifer. And they came to us and we found a series of projects that could work, but the one that worked best and was most shovel-ready was this first Sapphire Necklace project. So Pepsi just announced that they're providing it, as they describe it, a catalytic investment to implement the first Sapphire Necklace project to restore wetlands and then also construct the well that can be used to recharge the aquifer, to effect superficial groundwater recharge through the wetland rehydration and upper Floridan recharge through the well construction. So the other thing that's this addresses water quality issues, some of them regulatory. In Florida, we have something called minimum flows and levels, which is another regulatory issue, and the hydrologic restoration of the watershed. But the other thing that's really cool about this is it's in a broader context of a landscape that has a series of wildlife management areas, the Florida Wildlife Corridor, mitigation and mitigation projects and mitigation banks, the Green Swamp Wilderness Preserve. Nearby city of Haines City is doing a very similar project for Lake Evo, lake and wetland restoration. And there's a recreational trail system that is also part of this whole thing, so you can actually go out and enjoy this restored landscape. So to sum up, in the 80s and 90s, on the regulatory side, compensatory mitigation was formalized in state rules, countrywide, and in federal rules, mitigation and mitigation banking. And on the federal side, it's still guidance, of course. And then in the aughts, ecosystem services, the global reporting index, this voluntary thing really starts maturing in a way that becomes meaningful and provides important tools for corporations to benchmark and track their environmental practices. With the 2008 mitigation banking rule at the federal level here in the US, and its framework of the watershed approach being the central element of why this is an important, as the central governing principle for that rule, provides a really important framework for the intentional integration of regulatory offsets, public land conservation and restoration initiatives, and voluntary ESG-driven offsets for water quality, aquifer recharge, biodiversity, habitat diversity, and watershed protection. And with that, I'll stop for a little while.
Thank you so much. And is that working? That, I mean, the holistic and the voluntary dynamic, we're going to come back to this question about, you know, the role of voluntary and how big those markets are going to be. And so our final panelist, and before we get into the dialogue, is Brian Kevill from MKO. And Brian is the environmental director of MKO, Ireland's largest environmental and ecological consultancy firm. He has more than 20 years of professional consultancy experience as a project director, project manager, and a lead coordinator of environmental impact assessments for large-scale infrastructure projects. MKO has been at the cutting edge of environmental planning fields in Ireland for the last decade, and it really is a wonderful thing to have you all the way from Ireland, Brian, to talk a little bit about the European context.
Yeah, thank you, George. And as George said, I hope to provide a different perspective today, and that's a European perspective on nature restoration and nature conservation. You might ask, what's an Irish guy doing sitting on a stage at they're asking, at a mitigation banking conference in the States. Well, as George said, back home, I run one of the largest, or the largest, environmental and ecological consultancies. And we don't have anything like this. You know, we don't have anything like this industry. We don't have anything like this expertise. But what we do have is a huge amount of policy coming our direction. And I've described it as a wave of policy. And if we're sitting on our surfboard, you know, looking out into the ocean, looking at this wave that's building, it's getting a hell of a lot closer and it's getting a hell of a lot bigger. And what we're trying to do here is we're trying to paddle frantically to get our business and our country's environmental policies up to speed to be able to catch that wave that's coming, that wave of policy. And you know, it's incumbent on us to look to the US and look to an industry like we have here today, and use the experience and use the expertise and use the knowledge that has been acquired over the last number of decades in this space. And we have to leverage that experience and expertise, and we have to, in a European context, take advantage of that, you know, late mover advantage that would help us avoid perhaps some mistakes that might have been made here in the early years. So that's what I'm going to do. I just have a slide there to kind of guide the few minutes that I'm going to speak on this. But first of all, just from a European perspective, on the other side of that Atlantic Ocean, there's 450 million people spread across the European Union. So there's 27 countries that are with, you know, members of the European Union, but the 27 countries make up one single market. So it's one single market where the European Commission and publish and put into force environmental legislation and every other type of legislation. Europe is the third largest economy on the globe, and 1/6 of global trade originates or goes through Europe. But the first and the biggest and most exciting thing that I'm going to talk about is the EU's nature restoration laws. And these were first published in draft format in June of last year, June of 22. And these have really been a game changer. They're still not set in stone, they're still being finalized, but we expect the final version to be published now in the next few weeks. But what the EU nature restoration laws do is they set really, really ambitious targets, not just for the protection of what's already listed for protection, but for the restoration of nature. So, for example, you know, by 2030, plans have to be in place to restore 30% of the species and habitats that are already protected, okay? And these have been protected for some time, but there's been no real imperative or no real requirement to restore their condition by a certain date. That figure is going to ramp up to 60% by 2040 and 90% to 2050. And the plans will have to be in place to put those protected species and habitats onto a different trajectory than they've been on to date. So the policy is being set at a European level, and then it will be up to each of the individual 27 member states to prepare a nature restoration plan specific to their country, their protected habitats, their protected species. But the overall ambition, the overall objectives of the laws are set at a European level. And each of those individual member states will have individual monitoring and reporting obligations. And this has been the way that every other European law has been rolled out since the formation of the European Union. And to just give you one example of one of these objectives, by 2030, Europe will have to restore 20,000 miles of rivers to a free-flowing status. So they will have to remove, across all those countries, including Ireland, remove artificial barriers and restore 20,000 miles of free-flowing rivers. Flipping for a second now into the UK, because the UK left the European Union, if anybody didn't realise that a few years ago. Still can't figure out why. But in the UK, there's been a different law enacted there, which is going to come into effect from November this year. And it's going to require 10% biodiversity net gain to be delivered on every development project that's proposed from that point on. So what they've done in the UK is they've devised a metric whereby any site or any area can be given a score, and they've used the term biodiversity unit. Okay, so the biodiversity unit has essentially become or will become the universal translator to allow you to take grassland habitats, woodlands, peatlands, or the relevant habitats of whatever species and convert it into a single unit that can translate one way or another. And in any development project then that's being proposed, whether it be by a state authority or whether it be by a private developer, the private developer has to assess the biodiversity value of their project, has to assess what the biodiversity loss in terms of units is going to be as a result of their development, and demonstrate then how they're going to deliver the 10% biodiversity uplift or biodiversity gain on their project, either on-site or off-site. And the ability and the mechanism to deliver these gains off-site has given rise now to essentially a market in the UK that will allow banks to be developed, and the development of mitigation banks is underway. Flipping again now back to the European perspective, and I'm just going to speak about corporates for a minute, and there's been some discussion about this already. But there are a number of other directives that have come out of Europe, such as the Non-Financial Reporting Directive, such as the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, and the EU taxonomy as well, which is essentially going to really shine a light on what corporate entities are doing in a way that they've never had to report on before. And the idea of the EU taxonomy is that it's going to ensure that there's complete transparency in terms of where money and where investment is going, and whether it actually is going into what are classified as sustainable developments or not. We're also seeing a lot of voluntary corporate efforts, both at a project level and at a policy level. So to give you an example of a project in Ireland, Intel have a huge manufacturing and development plant in Ireland, and they've been based there for 25, 30 years. But in the upper reaches of the catchment where their large manufacturing plant is based, they've funded the restoration of a bog, of an upland peatland habitat. No obligation on them to do so. It wasn't linked to anything else that they wanted to do, but they've just voluntarily, helped fund this project with the Irish National Parks and Wildlife Service as a partner. And from a corporate policy perspective, we see the likes of Ørsted. So Ørsted would be the largest developer of renewable energy projects in Europe, And Ørsted, probably 18 months ago, adopted a new policy whereby every project that they develop, whether it be an onshore wind farm or an offshore wind farm or a solar farm or whatever it might be, has to be a nature positive project. So justifying that we're only going to have this small of an impact, or we're going to break even in terms of our biodiversity footprint, seems to be not good enough anymore. And I think, you know, that's the way that we're seeing a lot of businesses wanting to go with their policies. We've also seen some very large-scale investments, so pension funds buying up, you know, 4,000 or 5,000 acres of land in Scotland to run carbon and peatland restoration projects. And they know that they'll be able to realise the value from the carbon that those projects are going to capture into the future, and they'll be able to sell that. And if in time there's a biodiversity credit or a biodiversity value associated with that restoration projects as well, you know, they're obviously going to want to be able to realise that value. But right here, right now, that's not the motivating factor. If it comes in time, it seems that they'll be more than willing to take the value then. So there's certainly significant interest and willingness. And finally, just for the last minute, just to put some numbers on this in terms of what's happening and what's coming from a European perspective. So there's been 20 billion euro, so you could take it, it's $20 billion, per annum now committed by the European Commission, the European Union, to fund the restoration of nature. There's initially going to be 7.5% increase into then 10% of the European Union's budget, annual budget, directed to nature restoration. And it's been estimated that between now and 2030, there's going to be 480 billion required to do what has been set as the objectives. But there's actually only 295 billion currently available or committed. So there's 185 billion euro shortfall of funding that is going to have to come from the private sector, is going to have to be sourced and directed and reported upon. And I think that presents a huge opportunity that we'd certainly be excited to help capture. And you know, Europe is new to this in terms of funding. So 75% of the funding that goes into sustainability and goes into nature-based projects worldwide originates from Europe. But actually only 25% of that is actually utilized in Europe. So, you know, with what's coming in this wave of policy and wave of support that's coming for nature restoration, it certainly appears that there's going to be a much larger market in Europe, and we're certainly excited to be part of that and to take every bit of learning that we can from the fantastic US market and industry back with us, and invite you all over to Europe as well and to Ireland to see what you can do with us. So thanks.
As you can see, I think you can see the benefit of having these dialogues, of learning from what's happening in Europe and beyond the U.S. And there's so much that they can learn from us and we can learn from them. And we're going to be exporting a lot of you guys to Europe to help, because, you know, I think, you know, when you think about stream, we have some of the best stream practitioners in the world. Why shouldn't we be doing that type of activity? So it's really, really interesting. I want to come back maybe where we started with Chris a little bit and kind of get your thoughts and maybe dig in a little bit on the carbon markets, and then your thoughts on applicability to the wetland stream markets, and I'll get to that. But obviously, you all have looked hard at the carbon offset market and the reports relating to that, and whether it's your regulatory reviews applicable to that and your thoughts on that. So I'd love that. But then also, there are folks exploring secondary markets in the wetland stream world, and creating more liquidity and a great opportunity in that market. And I wanted to get your sense about how you all might view that that scenario.
Absolutely. So let me give my standard regulator admonition. My views are my own. They are not representative of the Commission the commissioner, or any other commissioners. So with that out of the way, so Chair Benham, so I should explain maybe the composition of the CFTC as well. So we are a 5-member bipartisan commission. So current composition is 3 Democrats, 2 Republicans. Commissioner Mersinger, who is my boss, is one of the Republican commissioners. But the chair of the commission is a guy named Russ Benham, and Russ actually kind of made a name for himself when he was a commissioner under the Trump administration by doing a report on the environment, specifically focused a lot on carbon markets. And so it's something that is near and dear to his heart. And when he first became chair, he did a request for information on carbon markets, and he's been thinking about it, and recently he did an interview where he said, I am thinking about putting together principles for spot market carbon governance. And this for us is a very, very, very big deal because, as I said, right, the CFTC is not a spot market regulator. We are specifically told you do not do anything with spot markets, you are a secondary markets regulator. But the issue that we have in carbon markets is that there's really no spot market regulator. So all those other markets that we were talking about, so for example, we talk about cattle, right? The US Department of Agriculture regulates the spot market in cattle. When we talk about corn, you know, same thing. In almost all of our markets, you have some level of spot market regulation. And in addition, the end user uses the product. So if somebody shows up with a shipment of gold and it's not exactly gold, they get really mad and things happen. With carbon credits, it's a little bit different because the end user is divorced from the creator of the carbon credits. And in addition, for it to be a bona fide carbon credit, there has to be this concept of additionality, which is very difficult to figure out as well. So what Chair Benham is thinking is, we normally don't do this, we shouldn't do this, but we're going to make a special exception because these markets are really, really important and you have those fundamental distinctions. And one thing about the CFTC is that we regulate a variety of derivatives markets and they're all a little bit unique and a little bit different. And so essentially if he does this, what he will signal is, remember I said we have that fraud and manipulation authority. So those principles will be promulgated for the spot market. That will inform the exchanges that list those derivatives products. And if you, as a spot market creator of carbon credits, do not live up to those principles, you may get a knock on your door from the CFTC. And so obviously we're a while away from this, but that's the type of thing that you might see happen in a year or so. And the thought is that we have an interest in market integrity writ large. And we have an interest, and I think Chair Benham really believes strongly in making sure that carbon markets work and are successful. And this is a way to make them successful, to get some principles that we can all agree on, and then to have a broader adoption of carbon credits and carbon markets. So
what happens now if we're talking wetlands and stream, which we're not regulating today, but what happens if we begin to promote secondary markets for that? Would that be something you all can look at?
Yeah, I mean, hey, we are, like I said, completely agnostic, and the way it works is our exchanges come to us and say, we've been working with these people in this industry, and they feel like there is a desire to list this product, and then we go through our product review function, which basically makes sure that the product can be listed. But it's interesting to hear when we talk about the credits that are being generated, that looks a lot like a lot of the other markets we have, and we're familiar with compliance markets, and we're familiar with working with, so in this case it's the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers is the spot market regulator. It is kind of ironic in the sense that unlike the carbon credit market, there actually is a very robust spot market regulator, which makes your job as a secondary market regulator a lot easier because you can just refer back to that. So in essence, you say that we're talking about the producer, so you create a carbon credit, or you think that you're going to create a carbon credit in 6 months or so. You can go to an exchange, you can see what the price is for that credit, you can budget the resources that you're going to expend to create that credit based on what the current spot market or futures price of that credit is. You can sell it into the market, so you can future sell it, and then you will have to deliver it at that future date. But then that corporate who's thinking about expanding, and my understanding is, and And I apologize because I'm obviously probably the newest person in this entire room to these markets, so please find my ignorance an attempt to learn more about these markets and potentially charming. So my understanding is that you as a corporate may choose to develop in a certain place, and you can purchase that credit, and then if you decide to develop somewhere else, you can sell that credit back out into the market, and there's going to be a market for that. And then what that also does is it brings in private capital. So we were talking about ESG investment. There are lots of funds that are interested in figuring out ESG opportunities. And so this is a prime example, so supporting folks that are producing carbon credits, or if they decide, we just want to purchase the credits themselves, that can be an ESG investment too. So you have all these new streams of capital that can enter the market, either to support the producers of carbon credits or to purchase the credits themselves. And then from the corporate side, from the end user side, it's kind of an exciting opportunity because they get to see what the market looks like so they can fix their costs. And then they can look at different areas to develop, and they can decide, well, I'd rather develop here because this price is more competitive or these markets are more liquid. And then in terms of directional signals, so I was at a session earlier today where we talked about one market where there was a lack of credits. So when we see that a market is less liquid, but there's a great demand, then all of a sudden that's a price signal. And so you as a producer can say, okay, I've decided to devote more resources to that market because I know that there's a great deal of demand, there's a lack of supply, the prices are obviously going up. And those are types of market signals that we can see in our markets because they're transparent, that if you're not in a CFTC regulated derivatives market, you're just not gonna have that.
Well, if you are in a CFTC regulated market, does it require price discovery and price?
Yeah. I mean, and so a big hallmark of our markets is price discovery. This is a much broader controversial issue. I feel like it's a little bit easier for me though, because if I was in a conference with CFTC practitioners, everybody would sort of lean up and say, what do you, but at the basic level, when we talk about our markets, they're supposed to be transparent. So when a trade is consummated, it is recorded. And so that's something that is publicly available to the folks on the exchange, to the CFTC, and then that information is promulgated to the public at large.
And let's turn to you on this voluntary regulatory intersect. And you've lived obviously the regulatory world, and we're a big part of the 404 mitigation rules. And now you're playing in this, with PepsiCo making major investments in the voluntary side. What do you see as the future and the role of voluntary markets? And will it surpass the regulatory markets? Well, how do you view this?
Well, I don't know about that last question. Gosh, it was 15 or so years ago that I first started trying to find a consultancy market for how do I help people with this ecosystem services thing and make some money off of that, and consult with them, help them with their ecosystem services goals. But it was truly voluntary at that time. There was no incentive, unless it was a regulatory incentive. The voluntary side of the world just didn't work. But in more recent years, this ESG is becoming real, as I'm understanding from our clients. So for instance, right now I'm working on with another, I can't say who it is, but another national global entity that in this particular case that they're focusing right at the moment with our team on water quality issues. And so I've been asked to look in a particular state for water quality projects to offset the water quality, because they're getting their water supply out of a surface water source. There's water quality issues with that source. So their ESG goal in that setting is to improve the water quality of the system as their payback. We're working with other entities on aquifer replenishment. For those of you in this room, I think a lot of you know that we're having a lot of issues with our aquifers. Many of them are depleting and are overcommitted. And this is we have people nationally working working with this issue. It's not just the city of Winter Haven. It's a real issue. And again, I can't talk about the specifics of it. But and right now, we're all things water, so we aren't like in the biodiversity space. We tend to be in the water space. But to me, it feels like, holy moly, if each facility that's in a water-stressed area needs to start offsetting, yeah, I mean, that market, it's growing. It feels very real to me.
And I think that's the learnings that we've had from Europe, which is when we talk about biodiversity, you would include water-related resources in that definitional construct of biodiversity. It's not just species and endangered species. So I think it's really interesting about the initiatives that are going on in that regard to be much broader thinking relative to where our markets are today in the U.S. But Brian, you mentioned all this great stuff on the nature restoration program, and I'm curious about, like, we had the federal mitigation rule. It came out of a law that was passed in 2003. It took 5 years. We're still now working on conservation banking rules. I hope they're less than 5 years, and folks in this room will know better on the timing. What's your sense of the process, the funding? You mentioned funding deficits. I'm curious where do they expect the funding to come from and the process?
Yeah, so the process is going to be, George, that from the enactment of the nature restoration law, each of the countries are going to have 2 years to come up with their nature restoration plans. Now, the countries are going to have a lot of discretion in that. The prospect of environmental markets or banks has absolutely been floated, but it will be up to the individual countries to decide, do they want to go down that route. I think the biggest challenge is, there's going to be a challenge in terms of trying to, the scale of the challenge in terms of what has to be done is so enormous. It's probably difficult to just comprehend at this point. And I think, the public authorities that are there, the various bodies that are charged with protecting and restoring nature right now, they're going to be maxed. They will not have the capacity, they will not have the resources, even if they had the money, as somebody on a panel was saying earlier, even if they had the money, they won't have the ability to actually deliver what needs to be delivered. So we will need their very best efforts, and more, and we'll need the very best efforts of the best people on the planet as well, to come in with private projects and help achieve those goals. So, there's going to be a big focus in Europe in terms of diverting funding from what's called the Common Agricultural Policy, which is a mechanism to support agriculture and agricultural production, a lot of which is unsustainable, and to essentially encourage farmers and pay them to farm nature, essentially, or to farm in a much more sustainable way. And it's funny because, over the decades, the European Union have funded hugely unsustainable forms of agriculture and have promoted intensification and the draining of wetlands and the draining of peatlands, to bring those areas into agricultural production. And now they're going to have to pay to reverse that again. But a lot of the agriculture that hasn't been industrialized, really isn't sustainable financially or environmentally. So hopefully by making it more, or by paying the farmers to just farm differently, will make it more environmentally sustainable.
I'm also curious, so I attended COP15, and for those of you who don't know, that's the Convention for Biological Diversity, overseen by the UN. And basically, the U.S. was a big part of that in setting up that convention, but we never signed the treaty. And that was during Bush 1 era, and it was primarily because the pharmaceutical companies didn't want to give up the rights to biodiversity. And so we're one of two. We had the Vatican and the U.S. that didn't sign the treaty. And as a result of that, when you attend COP15, it was there's all this talk about we're going to create a nature-positive world and biodiversity crediting. And when you start digging into the standards of biodiversity crediting, it's being driven by folks that never have lived it. And I'm like, well, we need the U.S. experience to help inform that. But I'm curious from your thoughts about what are you seeing in the definitional approach, if at all, on biodiversity credits, which are the voluntary credits that are coming out of COP15.
Yeah, I think the challenge there, George, is going to be how you relate, how you come up with that universal translator that I mentioned earlier. You know, in the UK, they have the biodiversity unit. It's far from perfect, you know, as we're getting closer to implementing it, and, you know, some of the projects and the clients that we're working for are asking us to, you know, use that tool in an Irish context, where again, there's no obligation to do so, but there's a willingness and a desire on their part to do so. So, you know, in doing it in that voluntary capacity, we've found many flaws with it. But again, the people that have come up with this, and the DEFRA in the UK that have devised this biodiversity unit metric, have held their hands up and they say, we know that this is imperfect, but we're going to improve it as we go. But I think that's going to be, you know, that's going to be something that for a market to develop. It is a real challenge in terms of how you relate, you know, the value of one species and the restoration of a certain area of habitat for that species to an area of habitat that might be, you know, is obviously, you know, is protected because there's only a certain amount of it left. But I think we'll only learn by doing, and we got to get on and do it.
And so one of the things we're saying that might drive that is disclosure, Chris. And we think, come back, and you may not have an answer to this, and I told you I might ask you about it, but the SEC rules on disclosure relating to climate. When you think about shining the light and what that does to corporations in terms of their commitments, it's significant, even without having to do a regulatory program. And I'm curious whether you have any insights on where we're going with the SEC draft rules that have been held in abeyance for a period of time. And I know that's not where you work.
No. Always happy to opine on our sister regulatory agency. Yeah, whenever I think that our problems are a little bit tough, I look over there and I say, we have nothing to worry about. Yeah, so let's fast forward to the end and then work our way back. Like, there's going to be a lawsuit, right? It's going to be a really big lawsuit, and then we have what is now the major questions doctrine that the Supreme Court has promulgated. The Supreme Court is also currently looking at Chevron deference, which is that deference to the basically governmental bureaucrats, the administration, in interpreting congressional statutes, and that is going to be a very big determinant of whether or not this regulation is going to succeed or fail. So that's the end result, right? It's a court case, probably a Supreme Court case. Let's move back now and think about, so the issue there is materiality. So why do we have disclosures in the corporate sense writ large, right? If I am thinking of buying stock in PepsiCo, there are certain things that I want to know, right? I want to know how profitable they are. I want to know what their revenue is, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So the question, and this is really a good existential kind of philosophical question, does the average investor care about the carbon emissions or biodiversity or any of those other issues? And so then if you are an economic purist, what you say is, no, I invest in stocks because I want to make money, and all I care about is making money, and all of this is irrelevant. Then on the other side, where you say, well, I'm a human, and I care about corporate citizenship, and corporations seem to care an awful lot about that. I noticed that PepsiCo, when they did this, didn't say, please don't mention our name at all, right? So if the corporation...
It was a big press release.
Yeah, exactly, right? So if the corporation cares, maybe I should care too. And so that is the battle that's going on. And it's very interesting from a corporate perspective because you have a lot of those major corporations, either individually or through their trades, who are saying, you know, we love the environment, but we don't know how much we love it. So they are looking in some cases to pare back some of the disclosures that are being required. And so then there's this big debate that's going on. But at the end of the day, really, I think that what we need to sort of take from it is that there's going to be, the trend is towards increased disclosures. There will be increased disclosures in some way, shape, or form, but it all ends up in that Supreme Court case, and that's where things ultimately end. But there is this very big debate going on about the role of corporations in society and how we choose to invest or not invest, and that goes to the ESG investments as well.
Well, and so to be determined is like ESG.
And the one thing that I'd say is, so we have this the case that's looking at Chevron deference coming up. I would say that decision is expected in, I think it's going to be several months. It'll happen this year, and that I think will be a big determinant in whether or not the Supreme Court will defer to the SEC's interpretation of what a reasonable investor would like to know about carbon emissions.
I think I've laid out the case about materiality. Our gross domestic product, at least 50% of it's reliant on biodiversity, if not more. And our GDP may decline if we don't do anything about it. So I think you got a decent case on the materiality on that side of the equation.
I don't think it's a foregone conclusion, and I also think there's a lot of push and pull in terms of how the rule is done and how it's justified and the comments in the record. So yeah, it's very much a live issue.
And I want to come back to you, and this is one of my favorite topics. They call me Double Dippin' George for stacking. It's been a long hiatus, and now we're coming, but we never answer the question. Like, is it stacking? Is it not? What are the rules? Can you do it? And now we're using this term multiple benefits, and then if you throw in voluntary, it's okay. And so, do you have any thoughts on like multiple benefits versus stacking and how that's playing out at all?
I just listened to Eric Olson talk about that. You hear Eric? There he is. Talk to Eric about that. But I think it's always an it depends.
Yeah.
Sometimes, especially if it's in the voluntary space, I mean, you can multi-benefit all you want. Or for instance, like I happen to be on the board of the Florida Native Plant Society. So even though I work for a water firm, I care about plants and pollinators and stuff. So if I had anything to do with talking about, say, a mitigation bank, we're getting wetland credits for it. I would probably also be one of the things I also would talk about is the biodiversity in the plant world and the endangered species. And so you could talk about it, but and there are, as Eric explained to us, and as some of us know here in Florida, there is some, you can combine some credits here in our state and get panther and wetland credits, but you have to parse them that way at the outset. Yeah. And honestly, I'm not entirely sure how that's going to play out as the future plays out. But I like that idea of, I'm a little bit of a statistics wonk. Or a math wonk, so I actually care about, I want to know exactly how everything's partitioned. Somebody said here that we're missing, and I think Susan Marie Stedman was saying we're missing opportunities by not doing more NRD banks. So I think that I don't see why you can't like have a bank that as long as you're accounting for the acreage and the lift associated with the different parts of the bank, stratifying the bank, why you couldn't, if you still had acreage and functionality left over, you couldn't reparse those as recharacterize an area as for NRD purposes, for instance. And I don't think that answers your question, but
there hadn't been an answer yet. But one of the things, the other thing, and we saw this maybe in Louisiana, where we're looking at the coastal protection efforts, and there was lots of money for that to build wetlands, and then you had wetland mitigation, and there are two different set of rules as to what each wanted. Yep. And my thing was, could you harmonization of standards? Is there a way to look at about all the programmatic monies to a point where you could harmonize, where you could have multiple uses and not have two distinct approaches to how you do wetlands?
And some of what was going on in Louisiana is you have these conservation and restoration initiatives for the public good. So that's a whole different thing versus you also have within that same geographic context various mitigation bank projects that are set up specifically for certain types of wetland impacts. You know, they're for a regulatory offset. They have different purposes. I mean, but I do think that they should be playing together and working together to build, to rebuild as much of that coastline as possible. And they should be prioritizing where, I have a lot of personal opinions about how they might be prioritizing efforts in the Louisiana coast to protect Lake Pontchartrain, for instance. There should be a lot of kumbaya going on in coastal Louisiana to affect some meaningful conservation and restoration. And there's no reason why there couldn't be.
Well, I think it's time for the audience. We've got a couple minutes here left, and looking forward to hearing any questions and thoughts from the audience. And we have a couple runners. Just raise your hand, and look forward to hearing the thoughts, questions.
Thank you, George. That's a great panel that you put together there. This has been fantastic. I've got a question for Mr. Kevill about the biodiversity credit or biodiversity index that's being used. Curious to know, is that something that is extremely specific to each country, or is that something that might be translatable back to this side of the Atlantic?
So the biodiversity unit has been devised by DEFRA in the UK. So it's only a UK tool right now. As I said, we're using it because we're using it in the absence of anything else, you know, to essentially, you know, try to measure biodiversity on a particular site, on a particular project, in a way that can be, you know, essentially that we can just put numbers on it. You know, rather than trying to, you know, describe the value of a site in more abstract terms. You know, if we can nail this and we can, you know, actually put a score on a site, it has huge applications and very broad applications. You know, how frequently they're going to, acknowledging from the outset that it's imperfect and will require updating. We don't know at this point how frequently they're going to update it. But you know, as it's refined with further use, we'd certainly like to think that, you know, we'll be using a version of it. If you take the BNG, the biodiversity net gain, and that biodiversity unit metric, and apply then to the other countries in Europe that are within the European Union and will have to come up with their own methods and means of restoring nature, it remains to be seen as part of their individual, you know, country by country restoration plans, whether they look to devise their own biodiversity unit metric. I think the more that do it, the better it'll get. You know, but the UK is the only one that we've seen to date.
My question's for Brian also. You'd given a very large number for rivers that would need to have a dams removal and stream restoration. Can you talk a little bit to what a river is like in the UK, like size-wise compared to a river in the States? Are we talking about, you know, big rivers, small rivers? What do you talk about when you say river restoration or dam removal?
So the 20,000 miles, or it's actually 25,000 kilometers in our units, that have to be restored to a free-flowing status. That has to be achieved by the removal of structures. The wording of it refers to structures that are no longer required. So if there's a hydro dam that's still in use, obviously, you know, they're not requiring that to be removed. But in terms of weirs, in terms of, you know, other structures that were put in place at a point in the past where they're no longer serving their original function. Again, I think that's our reading of, you know, where the priority is going to be for you know, what has to be restored. But obviously, depending on the scale of the river and the watercourse, and depending on the size of the structure, you know, removing one artificial barrier on a very large river could have a much bigger benefit in terms of the upstream and the downstream impact of you know, restoring the free-flowing status of a very large reach. But the detail isn't there yet in terms of you know, how it might be applied on different sizes and scales of rivers.
So is it mostly related to connectivity of species? Is that what's driving it, or what is the idea of the removal?
It's down to, I suppose, just restoring that free-flowing status, and then deriving all the other benefits that are going to come from that in terms of habitats and in terms of species.
Tim Baumgartner, the EPR. We in the regulatory marketplace are very attuned to having to produce data to show our uplift in what we are doing. The voluntary markets seem to be very devoid of data. I know Ann mentioned PepsiCo, and if you look at a lot of the sustainability reports, and there's not a lot to back up, hey, we did a lot of good, but the data is very devoid. How do y'all see some of those things that are going on, and how is that tide turning a little bit? Is it getting better? What do you see for the future of that?
Are you talking the quality of data within carbon markets? It's a little bit tough to hear up here. Is that right?
I'm sorry, carbon markets as well as the voluntary markets in general. It's, you know, a lot of the reporting is based on doing good, but there's not a lot of substantial data to say the good that was done. So,
Gotcha.
Yeah, like I think in the case of the Pepsi, the Winter Haven situation, the fact that as I mentioned, we identified a number of projects that could qualify for the funding for this purpose, this specific purpose. The one that was chosen was the most shovel-ready, and it was very important to Pepsi that they be able to report, demonstrably report that the money had been spent and the work had been accomplished. So that's reporting up to whoever that is. But I think you have to go to the individual entity, you know, Pepsi, Coke, whoever, in Intel, and see in their reporting what they had funded.
And Tim, you know, one of the things in the carbon side of the equation we're seeing a lot of, and this, I think CFTC is kind of looking at this, this question of improved forest management versus removal. It's very interesting, and I just was recently at a carbon removal conference with Credit Suisse, where the investors are basically saying, we are looking at removal over improved forest management and avoided emissions. We don't think those have a high integrity scenario. Now, how about sequestration from tree plantings? Well, that's an interest, but then you have to forward sell in order to make those really attractive from an economic perspective. And that's maybe where it becomes in your domain. And so I saw some papers where you all were looking at high, low, and medium, and that could be a dynamic where you're looking at if you wanted to do a derivative off of that, you would have to do it off of a high quality credit. So you can build that into the voluntary markets. They are evolving quickly. The carbon markets are a $2 billion a year market, and they're increasing by the day. And I think the corporates are serious because of disclosure and all the other things we've mentioned.
And I think the next step for these markets is that spot market regulation that we were talking about. And so there are current discussions. So the Farm Bill, which is the bill that's produced by the House and Senate Agriculture Committee that deals with everything from, you know, SNAP and nutrition to payments for crop producers, is going to consider having some of that language. Now, the big question is, what federal agency would want to be the spot market regulator? And nobody's exactly standing up and, you know, waving their arms. So I would think that maybe it would be the EPA, but I think there needs to be a governmental entity or some sort of self-regulatory body that's responsible for ensuring the integrity of the carbon credit.
I think we got Jody, or is our last? Yes. we'll make
All right,
that
and
our
I will,
last.
I will refrain from asking any jokes or anything like that. So thank you all very much, very informative. So Jody Bickle, Creek Bank Associates, and I wanted to go a little bit further in the corporate sustainability space and ESG to round us out. So Anne definitely referenced that several times, but I think it's open to everyone. And it's really more of an invitation to explore how we build that dialogue with the corporate leadership. So right now, what I see is sort of a not strong awareness of the connection between environmental markets and corporate sustainability leadership. And so it is incumbent upon us to bridge that divide. And so I would, I guess, draw attention to our markets and resiliency and nature-based solutions and watershed program-driven projects where the PepsiCo example was shared by Anne, but also individual corporations that are looking to meet their own needs from their own insetting projects. That's opportunities for project developers there. It's just in a different context. And so I wanted to open it up to you all to talk a little bit more about advancing our dialogue within the corporate sustainability leadership structure.
I might come in there to start, George. I think what we're noticing isn't a lack of ambition, and it's not a lack of appetite. It's a lack of awareness about what can I do. And when you put an option in front of a corporate, company or developer, generally the response we would say is, or here is, that's a great idea, let's do that. But nobody had ever put the proposal or the idea to them to date. And so I think, the people that know what could be done need to spend more time talking to the people that need to, that need to report on, the non-financial reporting obligations, the corporate sustainability reporting obligations that are coming out of Europe. So it's not a lack of a will, it's not a lack of money either, because generally in the context of the larger corporate entity or the project that they're trying to promote, the sustainability costs are minimal. They're a minimal additional cost to the project or to the entity. So we just need to continue to build awareness and put the options in front of them, I believe.
And Jody, I love the idea of
Looking at you.
if we had excess credits from banks, why not be able to sell them to sustainability? Why not do that?
Yeah, I think at the lack of being kind of warm and fuzzy about it, at the end of the day, it all sort of starts and ends with quarterly earnings. And if I'm not hitting my quarterly earnings target, then people are going to sell my stock. And then I, as a highly paid corporate executive, will have to find a different job. And so, but if you create an incentive structure, and this is why I think if you look at carbon markets, why have they been so wildly successful amongst corporates, whereas a lot of these other markets just haven't quite taken off yet? It is because you as a corporate executive who are very metrics focused are thinking, okay, this I get, like this is the amount of carbon that I emit, these are the number of credits that I have to purchase, there is a market where I can go and I can buy these things in the same way that I buy steel and aluminum.
Great.
Perfect, done. And so I think when we talk about a lot of these projects, and the good news is we are creating credits. So it's a credit in the same way that a carbon credit is a credit. And the thought is if you're a corporate executive, like you're happy that you're doing all these good things, but at the end of the day, you became a corporate executive because you like running companies. Okay, so I need to purchase X number of biodiversity credits. There is a market, I will purchase them. The people that know what they're doing, there's a spot market regulator to make sure it's all regulated, and I'm not going to be fined like the SEC went after all those companies for greenwashing. I don't want to be fined, I don't want to get in trouble. Then I'm happy, the planet's happy, my shareholders are happy, all is good with the world.
Let that be the last word. And join me in thanking our panelists.